Welcome to this first session on the theories of consciousness. In this session, we will go through and describe the first order theories of consciousness. This session is the first part of 4 sessions on the prevailing theories of consciousness, or you could say the theories of consciousness you as a neuroscientific researcher need to be aware of. And by that, we mean that there are several other theories of consciousness that we won't be dealing with. And we'll be focusing on those that we believe are most relevant for research right now. So you've no doubt heard a lot of interesting things about consciousness, maybe before this course or as a part of this course. And that's because there's so many fascinating aspects to consciousness. For these sessions right here, and what these particular theories of consciousness deal with is a particular problem with consciousness, namely what makes a mental state conscious at all, and why is it that conscious mental states have a particular type of phenomenological quality about them? Why does it feel a certain way to be conscious? And this is, of course, not the only interesting question about consciousness. However, it is true that if we are to have a complete theory of consciousness, meaning a theory that could fully explain consciousness, we would have to have that theory be capable of explaining what makes a mental state conscious and why is it that conscious mental states have phenomenological quality about them. So in this course, we will be discussing 4 theories on the theories of consciousness, which are the first order representation theories, which is also called recurrent processing theory. And in the second session, we'll be dealing with higher order thought theory, or HOT. And in this third session, we'll be dealing with global neuronal workspace, or GNW. And in the fourth session, we'll be dealing with integrated information theory, or IIT. So we can think of no better way to start out this first part with the first order theory of consciousness. And the first order theory of consciousness proposes that the difference between a conscious mental state and an unconscious mental state is simply that the conscious mental state is able to represent itself as conscious. So some first order theories are called so-called reflexive theories of consciousness. They argue that the mental state, in order to be conscious, needs to have a reflexive relationship to itself. So if we have a mental state here, A, and these are some of the early theorists on first order theory, Dredske and Tai. What the theory proposes is that for a mental state here, A, this mental state is an unconscious mental state. This A state here. And that could be, for example, perception or an experience of pain or belief or intention, or it could be, for example, a memory. So if it was, say, you were to memorize your childhood home, where you were remembering your childhood home, and then suddenly you become conscious of the fact that you are remembering. This first order theory would state that the mental state of remembering is able to represent itself as conscious, to have a certain reflexive relationship to itself. And this would make it into what is called B here, a conscious mental state. And the reason it is able to do so is simply because the mental state has this ability to represent itself. And so common to all the theories of consciousness is that they, in explaining what makes a mental state conscious or not, they will deal with whether some of the theories will deal with, will propose that the mental state needs a certain additional ingredient in order that needs to be added to the mental state in order for it to become conscious. But here, the first order theory proposes that it is something inherent in the mental state itself. It is something already present in the mental state. It is a specific property or characteristic of that mental state that it can use to determine whether or not it's conscious or not. And you could say it doesn't need anything else than itself in order to become conscious. So we can draw this red line around it, this border around it, to say that it doesn't need anything else to be conscious. So clearly the first order theory doesn't need any extra ingredient from the outside in order to take a to take an unconscious mental state and make it into a conscious one. And this is why we can draw this border around it. It doesn't need anything else. It is able to represent itself as conscious. And this is in opposition to what we will be dealing with in the next session, which is a higher order thought theory or hot theories, and where they require that another mental state is able to represent the first mental state as conscious. But here, first order theories simply state that the mental state is able to represent itself as conscious and doesn't need anything else. There are some variations of first order theories. Some of them claim that for the mental state to be conscious, they need to have this reflexive relationship to itself. They need, just as you could say, that the mental state is able to have a mirror that it can represent itself. Although that analogy is somewhat not working as well, because the mental state doesn't need the mirror. It is able to represent itself without anything. So it doesn't need anything to represent itself as conscious. So to explain sort of the representational and relation that it's able to hold, you can think of it in terms of a dolphin. And these representational theories explain that, for example, a dolphin, the word dolphin is a word, and that word has 7 letters. It is a representation, and the word itself is different from the content. The content of a dolphin is an aquatic mammal that swims in the ocean, and that is an actual dolphin that can swim, and an actual dolphin doesn't have any letters, whereas the representation is a word and has 7 letters, and this word cannot swim. So this is the difference between having a representation and what that representation has as its content. And for the first order theories, they state that the content determines the representation, although the two are not identical. So the content will always lead to the specific representation, but they're not identical. Now, this actually underscores something very important when we try to look for brain states or neural correlates of consciousness. And you can say this, that we are not, when we, for example, have a person who perceives the color red, we shouldn't necessarily look for red in the brain. That it's very unlikely that we will find red in the brain. Instead, we should find some other properties or dynamics which mirror or create a representation of the content red. And this is sort of inherently a part of the first order theory. Content and representation are intimately linked, but they are different. And this has one consequence, and it can be used by the first order theory to explain, since content is not identical with representation, that means that a representation could be false. So, for example, illusions or dreams or hallucinations are all examples where the representation of reality or the actual content out there in the world is false or is a wrong representation. A third aspect is that while it is true that a representation of content is necessary for a person to be conscious of that content, that is not the same as saying that any representation necessarily leads to that person being conscious of that content. And that could be said that having a representation of content is necessary for a person to be conscious of that content, but having a representation of content is not sufficient for that person to be conscious of content. So an example of this necessity and sufficiency conditions, which are very important in science, is the sun, for example, when it shines, that's a necessary condition in order for there to be sunlight on the Earth. But if, for example, the moon was blocking the sun, then you wouldn't get any sunlight. So the sun is necessary in order for there to be sunlight, but having the sun, if it is blocked by the moon, doesn't lead to sunlight. So it's not sufficient for there to be sunlight. And this is the same thing, that you could have a representation, and that is necessary for there to be consciousness, but it is not sufficient. So for example, if you were to perceive these orientation of lines here, you would be able to represent these lines in the brain and have representation of these line orientations, but it's not certain that that will lead to a conscious representation of these line orientations. So representation is necessary, but not sufficient. So one proponent of first order theory of consciousness is Ned Block. And to explain his position, it's perhaps instructive to explain the concept of the modularity of mind. So the concept of the modularity of mind is this notion that the mind or mental state, at least to some degree, is composed of individual parts or mental modules, if you will, which are distinct from each other. And they can be related to specific neural structures. And these mental modules have, for example, distinct evolutionary functions. And this was proposed by Fodor in 1983. And the concept of modules are concurrently are also called domains, like visual perception is a domain, language is a domain, and so on. And you can slice up the mind into these different modules and link it to neural structures. So for example, is the notion that there are modules related to language, like the Broca's area or Wernicke's area. Broca's involved in speech production and Wernicke in comprehension. And these are the main cognitive functions important for verbal report, you could say, so verbally reporting something. So to explain Ned Block's position, we're going to introduce another area, which is the fusiform face area, or FFA. And this area of the brain is involved in the processing of faces, and in particular familiar faces. And the stimulation of face of the FFA will distort face perception. And there's a lot of evidence here we won't go into, but importantly, as Block puts it, is the question about whether if you were to have a sort of Fodorian, a module of the FFA as this neuronal basis of face perception. And what he says, if you were to take the total neuronal state of this face perception, this FFA, which is involved in face perception, what is that? Is that sufficient for perceiving faces, for having a phenomenological experience of a face? And what Ned Block says is that conscious perception, maybe that is sufficient on its own, and it doesn't need report. So when you report that you perceive a face, or you don't perceive a face, or you perceive a familiar face versus a non-familiar face, is that report necessary for consciousness? And for Ned Block, he says, no. He says that conscious perception of the face in this module of the brain doesn't require verbal report in order for it to become conscious. And meaning when you perceive a face, you have this phenomenological experience of the face, and then you access it with verbal report and report what you're experiencing. So for Ned Block, he proposes that there are these two distinct neural correlates of consciousness. And this is what he calls phenomenological consciousness and access consciousness, or P consciousness and A consciousness. And for Ned Block, he argues that these two can occur without the other. And so if you look back at the original definition of first order theories of consciousness, it's easy to see how you can categorize Ned Block as a first-order theorist, because he's saying that a conscious mental state, a P-conscious or phenomenological conscious state, is sufficient for consciousness. You only need that phenomenological consciousness state in order for it to be conscious. You don't need to access it through your attention, through your verbal report. You don't need it in order to be conscious. You don't need another mental state to represent this first order state. The first order state is sufficient on its own to represent itself, you could say. So having access consciousness is fairly straightforward without phenomenological consciousness, because many of us can think of a time where we drove home in a car, and we had all of that information about how we were to drive, and we just drove home, and then we realized that we've been thinking about something completely different, and so our phenomenological consciousness has been somewhere completely different. But the problem is, can you have phenomenological consciousness without access? Or if you think back to the question about FFA, fusiform face area, and this conscious neural basis of the perception of faces, how can you ever report that you're having this conscious perception of faces if you can't access it? So that becomes difficult. For Ned Block, this also becomes a way of saying that the phenomenal consciousness and the cognitive machinery of access is different, and that therefore phenomenological consciousness is somehow non-cognitive, which is just to say that there are other researchers who disagree with him, who will say that consciousness is a type of cognitive function. So another thing that Ned Block uses this for is to say that phenomenological consciousness is incredibly rich. We have this large phenomenological consciousness, and it's larger than we can access. And so this is very intuitive to many, that we have this rich sensory experience. If you just look around in your room, for example, you will see many different things, and there will be many colors and shapes. And then if people ask you, well, what are you seeing? I'm seeing my room, my white background, and you have this very rich phenomenological experience, but then you're only able to access a very tiny portion of it. And just before we move on, there's a big discussion about whether there truly is a difference between access consciousness and phenomenological consciousness. And it is very acknowledged that it is a good theoretical and conceptual distinction to draw a boundary between access consciousness and phenomenological consciousness. But it's not certain that A consciousness and P consciousness are different in terms of can be empirically different, or is different in the real world. Although, according to Ned Block, he thinks that they can. So the last part of this on the first order theories, we will discuss recurrent processing theory, and this is sort of a newer version of the first order theory. And this is proposed by Victor Lame, and it is similar in several ways to the first order theories. So first of all, similar to Ned Block, Lame proposes a difference between access consciousness and phenomenological consciousness, although Lame proposes that consciousness is different from attention, where attention works in a sort of similar way to access consciousness. It is a type of spotlight on phenomenological consciousness. And another thing that's similar is between Ned Block and Lame, is that Lame also emphasizes that we do not need to access, we cannot access everything that we're conscious of. And attention has a type of bottleneck, if you will. That means that we can only have a limited amount that we're consciously aware of. So fundamental, he says, fundamental What Lama says is fundamental to the study of consciousness is the assumption that the conscious experiences are selective. We're not aware of everything we lay our eyes on. So the common view is that you have sort of a tiny amount that's attended, and then you have some unattended and something that's conscious. So as you get some visual input, and this is sort of the common view, whereas Lama's view is that you have this conscious consciousness that you experience and an unconscious mental state or unconscious mental states occurring, but then only a limited amount is selected by attention, and you can give conscious reports of this. And this is similar to net block. We can access less than we are consciously aware of. So central to Lama's proposal is that for a process to be conscious, it's proposed that it's correlated with a specific type of neuronal processing called recurrent processing. So recurrent processing is a type of cascade of neuronal activation that has been demonstrated. So, for example, if you present a visual stimulus and, or for example, you perceive motion, then that visual stimulus of motion, that will be processed in the early visual cortex, and it will move higher up in a feed-forward way up the visual processing hierarchy, as it's called. And this processing is still unconscious. And then at some point, it will return back, or you could say that the current of electrical activity returns and it becomes recurrent, similar to a boomerang. It sort of goes back on itself. And Lama claims that this type of neural correlate is the neural correlate of phenomenological consciousness. And there is actually some evidence to support this recurrent processing model. And for Lama, the recurrent processing neural correlate, you could say, is sufficient for phenomenological consciousness. And this is where we could say that Lama's view is a first-order theory, because it is claimed that recurrent processing is, for Lama, what creates phenomenological consciousness. So subjects, while they have to report or memorize their phenomenological experience, it may take some other mental states to do that, but at the core, it's a first-order theory. You could say it's a mental state, and because it has this recurrent processing as its neuronal basis, which does not require any other brain area in order for it to be phenomenologically conscious, in that sense, we can say that it is a first-order theory. So in sum, first-order theories of consciousness propose that the difference between a conscious mental state and an unconscious mental state is that the conscious mental state is just a mental state that is able to represent itself as conscious. So early proponents like Dredske and Tai, it was said that the mental state could represent itself or reflect itself, which is what made it conscious, and nothing needs to be added. For Ned Block, phenomenological consciousness is sufficient on its own to be conscious, and it is thus different and greater than what you can access from that you can access cognitively using access consciousness. You don't need access to be conscious. It was already conscious on its own. And for Victor Lama, the phenomenological consciousness has this concrete neural correlate in recurrent processing, which is enough on its own to explain how a mental state is conscious, and it can be accessed through attention. Attention can access that phenomenological consciousness. Similar to Block, phenomenological consciousness is greater than what you can attend to, and you don't need to attend to consciousness. It was already there on its own. Yes, thank you.